Today I'm going to be talking about SSBCI. Raise your hand if you know about SSBCI. Okay, so we have a few hands in the room. I know it's a few people here I know a whole lot about it. I have to throw this out there first, which is the lawyers make me say this. The application from Mississippi has still not yet been submitted to Treasury. After submission, Treasury's got to approve that application. And until approved, everything I'm saying is really just an approximation of what might actually happen, but we're not sure. Simply an outline of what's going on. So we're actually going to start an RFI process next week, and hopefully we'll have more certainty about this here as we move forward. So SSBCI, and specifically the venture capital program, I'm going to talk about more. But SSBCI in general is a federal program. Started in 2014, more money was put in November of 2021, and Mississippi has, out of the $10 billion nationwide, $86 million available in the state. And there are really three different buckets. There's a venture capital bucket, a debt fund bucket, and a loan guarantee bucket. And Innovate Mississippi is going to be in charge, probably, if things work out, of the venture capital bucket of those. And there also are three different releases of funding. So the $86 million doesn't all show up on day one. You've got to spend 80% of your tranche one in order to get tranche two, and there's some other set-asides and things like that. I will point out this is an interesting program by Treasury. It's got some very, very strong insider and conflict of interest rules. And as I mentioned, Innovate Mississippi today is planned to be running the venture capital portion of that program. Mississippi Development Authority will be running the program statewide, and we'll be running just that piece. So venture capital specifically. Right now, the plan is about a third of this is going to go into venture capital in Mississippi. A very important element, this is not grant funding. This is money that requires a one-to-one match with private capital, and the terms have to match that private investment. So we'll talk about the way this is going to work, but remember that from day one. So if you're going to get $100,000 and you get another $100,000 from this, it's not, the second is not free money, but in Mississippi it's going to be a one-to-one match required, and that's the minimum match required, and we're looking to probably do one-to-one in this. It's going to have a two-tiered approach to funding. The first tier will be investment funds can apply for money so that $1 million fund becomes a $2 million fund, or a $5 million fund becomes a $10 million fund. They can apply to match at that level, again at a one-to-one basis, and also understanding that the SSBCI money has to meet the same investment terms as your other investors. So again, it's not free money for the fund manager. Instead, it is going to double the size of the fund, but with the same terms as other investors. The other level is that companies will be able to, through a direct funding program, to get a one-to-one match when they have existing investors that they brought in. So a company comes in, they're raising $500,000, they already have $250,000. They can come in and through an application in our office and be able to get another $250,000 on the same terms as that first $250,000 they got. It's not free money again, it'd be the same. So if they're looking to raise $500,000 for 20% and they have $250,000 for their 10%, now they can get the rest of the $250,000 for another 10%. And then the goal of this program is to spur investment in these companies, to grow these companies here in the state, obviously to grow jobs and private investment through this program. By the way, I'm going to take questions at the end, but I'd be happy to interrupt. Please, in a small enough group. Yes?
Are you telling me that if I accept the one-to-one, the government is an investor?
Well, yes. Officially, there will be a Mississippi Evergreen Fund, which will be where the capital gets returned to, will be the limited partner in a fund or be the other investor in a fund. The money, when it first comes down, comes from Treasury, but then all that management of that will be through a private group, which will basically be where all the returns come to. So this can be done for many, many years. It's a 10-year program through Treasury, but we hope this will continue for 30, 40, 50 years.
There's an equity piece. Who owns the equity?
So this entity will own, it'll be the entity that will be called the Mississippi SSBCI Evergreen Fund will own equity if in that piece. Exactly right. And so Yeah, great questions, and that's an important element of this. By the way, the state of Mississippi is not allowed to own equity per the way the rules are. I mean, that's not a Treasury rule. That's the Constitution, I guess, of the state of Mississippi doesn't allow that. So that's why Innovate Mississippi will be managing this program and setting up this other entity in order to manage that. You had a question?
And as far as like the equity, the government has control of. Can you like buy them out? Is that continuous, or can it be? Are there like different terms regarding the equity?
Yeah, I will cover that a little bit more, but it has to be on the exact same terms as other investment. So you can, for example, do a convertible note, and you might have a conversion. It needs to have an automatic conversion provision if you're doing a convertible note under the equity program. But you could not simply buy back one portion and treat them any different than any other investor. They need to be have the exact same investment terms as all investors. And let me go a little deeper into the two layers of that, and they may explain that a little bit better. So under the fund program, again, this would be a venture capital fund. I know there's some folks here in the room that have run funds, and we hope will participate in this program. You would come in with your match at the fund level. And so again, the easiest way to think of it is your $1 million fund becomes a $2 million and multiples of that as it grows. The terms have to match other investor terms. Now, each investment you make will be subject to approval for compliance. Innovate Mississippi will be running this program, so we're going to make sure that's not a difficult compliance process. But we do have to make sure that if you're investing your SSBCI dollars alongside your private investor dollars, the company is domiciled in Mississippi. It does, fewer than 500 employees, some other requirements around that. And we're also going to ask the funds through the RFP process, we'll talk about in a minute, to set a commitment on underserved business investments. The SETI program, which for Treasury would mean minority-owned, women-owned, veteran-owned, rural, and there's even one other criteria I'm forgetting. Yes, or whose activity actually serves any of those groups. So it's women, minority, veteran, in certain locations, geographic locations, or rural. So it's going to be a pretty large swath of Mississippi if you look at the eligible entities that would do that. This is an equity program. There is a separate debt program. It's a little complicated, but Treasury makes you separate debt and equity programs. Under the equity program, it has to be equity, so ownership in the company, or convertible notes with automatic conversion, or a SAFE, or some similar equity instrument. You cannot, and we've had extensive conversations with Treasury, you can't just do a convertible note where you can accept repayment automatically or something like that. That's debt, if that's the case. It has to have automatic conversion provisions, although you can, of course, renegotiate later and do all those other things. Funds can charge fees, so the normal, a 2% fee, 20% carried interest can apply, except the average fee for a fund manager cannot exceed 1.71% over the 10-year life of the fund. Okay, so that means they could still charge 2% until the investment period's over and drop that to 1% or something similar, as long as it doesn't average more than 17.1% over the life of the fund, or 1.71% over 10 years, per year for 10 years. Funds will be then responsible under this program for reporting all the metrics, job numbers, all those other pieces, and returns will go back to that statewide SSBCI Evergreen Fund, we're calling it for now. We've not formed that entity officially yet because Innovate Mississippi doesn't have the contract yet. And again, all those other provisos, as said in the original slide, have to be done first.
So you're saying, though, that when you define returns, that's the non-carried interest piece. So that would be, assuming 80-20, that would be the 20%?
Absolutely. If the fund manager, the 80%, right. If the fund manager has those provisions for all their other investors, then the SSBCI would participate in the same way, and it would be actual returns like to the limited partners or other investors. The same would go back into this hopefully evergreen fund. And again, I know some of y'all would deal with this in different levels, so apologize if the questions are all over. Now, the other piece of that is we've got to go and select these funds. And what we're going to do is this really a two-stage process. The first is an informal informational process, and that's going to be a request for information process where we will publish potential criteria for selection of funds, and we're going to ask funds to submit, if they'd like to, it's completely optional, submit an application, and we will tell you this application would do really well because of this. These aspects probably won't score as well. we might, suggest this score might be something like this. We're going to give you as much information as we can around how your proposal would do in the future RFP process, but knowing the fact that we may change the criteria slightly, and from this feedback, we may see we are oversubscribed or undersubscribed. I will tell you that right now the venture capital folks are kind of elbow rooming, trying to get more dollars of the 86 million, because the debt funds and the loan guarantee folks say they could use all the money if they wanted to, if they could. So we'd love to have $40 million, $50 million of funds come in through this RFI process so we can try to make more room in our treasury application for more than the probably 1/3, which would be, close to what it's going to be. We are going to open this, by the way, still tentative because this has not been formally approved, but it's next Thursday, so it's probably going to happen next Thursday. We're going to open up an RFI process, publish a website that's going to have information around this, ask for feedback from anyone who's seeking a fund, have a public question and answer area on the website, and begin that process that will then close sometime before the end of the year. And again, this is an informal, you do not have to, if you're interested in a fund, you do not have to participate in the RFI process, but it will be a good way to get good feedback about potential scoring for funds prior to the formal RFP process, request for proposal process. That will be very similar, except it's the official version, where we will accept proposals and they will be formally scored, formally rated, and formally awarded funds in that process. And that actually, again, has to be, by the way, one final element of that's an important one, though. The actual fund, so let's say a fund comes in here and say they have commitments of $2 million. They don't get $2 million cash immediately. If they are calling that money on a 6-month annual basis, they can match dollar for dollar what's in their bank from private investors, but not faster than that. So they don't get a check for $5 million on day one just because they have commitments of $5 million. That's going to be part of that tracking process will be, okay, we've now gotten our actual cash in the bank of $1 million. Now, okay, here's another $1 million, and we will manage that process as well. This process is similar to the way some other states have done it, although we'll probably do a few things a little differently. There have been some states who've already begun this process. Louisiana, most notably of those that are close by, have already begun a process like this on the fund side. All right, and then the direct program. So for those people who are not getting investment from an SSBCI fund, because you can't match that $1. Remember, it's 1-to-1 private to SSBCI. So if you go to one of the funds that's already gotten money through the fund program and they invest, you can't come back again and match again, right? So $1 private, $1 of SSBCI. But there are going to be lots of companies who they need $300K, they only have $150. I mean, they have $200. Doesn't matter. It doesn't have to be 1-to-1. They need $300, they need $500, they've got half that. They would come through this direct process. This process will look a lot like the Mississippi Seed Fund does today. They will come in and probably the company and their investor who's already on board will be part of a pitch to this group and say, here's what we're doing. The investor will say, here's why I like the deal, and yes, I've committed to this, and they'll have to show us that. And then they can get matched exactly 1-to-1 in the same way. And again, has to match the same terms. We run that process very, very similar for those who are familiar with the Mississippi Seed Fund, but except you would bring your investor with you, and sometimes seed funds are made contingent upon investor funding. In this case, you'd have to actually have your investor funding secured, have to have an agreement in place. All right, any questions? Because I did cover a little better on that piece. So the entity that would hold that investment in that is likely, again, to be this Mississippi SSBCI Evergreen Fund entity would hold that investment, and any returns would go back into that entity as well. Yes?
Can the seed funds be part of the match and non-federal match too?
Unfortunately, seed fund is state money, and this has to be private dollars, so it cannot include state money directly. So the seed fund cannot be used as the match for the SSBCI program. It can be used alongside it. So let's say you were securing $300K, you get $100K private investment, another $100K through SSBCI, and now you've met the requirement for the seed fund, you could get another $100K for the seed fund. That's a lot of layering for that $300K, but you could do that for sure. Honestly, though, we probably will be we're still trying to figure out how that's going to happen. The seed fund today includes $100K. This is uncapped, so this could go up. We may try to work the seed fund to only be lower, more proof of concept funding, and then let this cover the higher dollar values. Yes.
So assuming that the application is successful, when will all this be set up? Like when would a private company be able to submit, to be eligible for this?
Wow, I could not have set that one up better myself. So the timeline. So I did not plan that, I promise. We're going to open up the RFI, which again is only informational. The direct funding program, to jumpstart yours, is probably looking at May for the direct funding option to be in place. Not the funds, but the direct funding. It can be done in parallel with the fund activity, but we're a small office and we are going to have a hard time getting it all done quickly, even hiring people as we're having to do. So May was when we'd probably expect to have the direct funding mechanism in place, assuming Treasury approves about the beginning of the year, which we anticipate will be the case, and all those other caveats I said. So we're going to kick off an RFI next week. So if you're interested in doing a fund, if you have, for example, we've talked to universities in Louisiana are participating in a similar way with their research foundations or others. Accelerators. So our co-builders accelerator, which we're going to talk a little bit more about tomorrow and the next day, will have probably an independent entity set up a co-builders fund so that any money that's in that can be doubled to go into those accelerator companies. There's really, any time you're investing $1 of private money and you want to do so in a pooled capital way, like a fund, those are the type of applications we would like to look at, even if it's only $200,000 or $300,000 fund or something. We could give you feedback on that, beginning with this RFI process. We're then going to close those and close those by the end of the year to give informal scoring and feedback by January, to then open up the RFP process so that we will then begin that RFP process sometime in the spring. We're saying March for now. We don't know exactly. And close that process and hopefully award funds by June of next year. Lots of things could go wrong. Remember back to my slide, which I will cover again, that all sorts of things could change. But that's the general outline for the SSBCI program. So the call to action right now is, if you have any interest in a fund, if we've been talking to a lot of folks about this, and anyone interested in an actual equity fund, this is the time to do it. You're essentially doubling your fund. If you're a fund manager, you're doubling your fees and your potential profit share and all those other things. But the big thing is we're doubling the amount of money being deployed into these Mississippi startups. Also, if there are any opportunities to go speak to any other groups or things like that, we'd love to start doing that as soon as next week. This is our first time to speak publicly about SSBCI, and again, we're not even awarded the role yet within the state. But if you have any interest, please let Lindsay know, or Lindsay Benefield, raise your hand. Lindsay Benefield, our investment manager, or me, Tony Jeff, know about that. And again, I have to throw this out again. None of this is official yet. However, this is what we anticipate happening. And I guess from that standpoint, Mississippi Development Authority will make their submission. Treasury will probably have feedback, but we anticipate Treasury approving this plan by the beginning of the year. So everything will be like RFI is an informal scoring. Everything will be informal until then. And then we will start to put in place the formal RFP process and the formal direct funding program. On that note, we are desperately needing people. So we actually have 4 openings and a staff of 5 people. 4 openings is a big deal. So we're losing Tasha Bibb to Mississippi State. I still haven't fussed at Jeremy for that yet. But and so we've got several openings at Innovate Mississippi. So we're going to be trying to staff this up as we get going on this and some other things that we'll be announcing here in the next few weeks, and hopefully have several of these things going by the beginning of the year. With that, I would love to take any questions.
Who would be in charge of governance?
Okay, so the U.S. Treasury will be watching MDA, who will be watching Innovate Mississippi, and then we will have in process, this will all be public in terms of how the process works, but that's going to be the general flow. So MDA has responsibility for the state, Treasury will be watching over them, and then we will have all of them watching over us. Yes?
Any time frame that the money has to be utilized and the government pulls it back? Because sometimes they do that.
That is not formally in place exactly, but the funds will need to outline what their plans are in order to then, and if they're not executing on that plan, let's say they said they were going to invest it all in 3 years and they didn't, then we'd have to just adjust accordingly. But there's not a formal clawback if you don't use it by a certain time. And I'm trying to see, is this starting my Q&A or is this done? Huh? That's it? Okay, all right. 2 minute, we got to transition to the next investor pitch. Please find me or Lindsay if there are any other questions. I didn't realize I'd use my whole time.
Worthwhile. Not everybody in the room may be familiar with the Mississippi Seed Fund and how you operate that. It might be good to just take 5 minutes and
Well, I can take 1 minute and 40 seconds. So the Mississippi Seed Fund is a program set in place by the state. Jim Lowry, who was just here, ran that program when it first started in 2007. We've been running the program that can invest in a convertible note up to $100,000 if you have investor match. And so that program has been operating now 60 some odd investments, large number of investments, been very active, and that's why the direct program will be modeled after that. And then we also will then be running the fund program a little bit, that's going to be an add-on. But the Mississippi Seed Fund process has been in place like that for a long time. All right. With that, we got 1 minute to the next presenter, so let me hand this off. Please find us for any other questions. I'll briefly bring this up again at breakfast and at lunch tomorrow, but please find us and we can help share any more information if we have it. Thanks.